The recent reports did not announce an ending, only an absence. News segments spoke quietly about a legend no longer seen, a face that once dominated cinema, now retreating from the light, a voice that shaped an era fading into silence. The screens moved on quickly, but the unease lingered, because when an icon disappears without explanation, the mystery grows louder than any headline. What the reports did not say was that this disappearance had been rehearsed across an entire lifetime. Long before the cameras stopped following her, Claudia Cardinale had already learned how to survive in the shadows of fame, carrying secrets that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The story does not begin with applause. It begins with a wound. On 1957, behind the glamorous illusion of a rising European starlet, an event occurred that would shape everything that followed. At just 18 years old, Claudia Cardinale was sexually assaulted by an older man she trusted. The crime was never prosecuted. The industry did not pause. The world did not slow down. Instead, it demanded silence. From that violence came a pregnancy, one that would be hidden, denied, rewritten, and locked away as a state secret while her career was carefully constructed for public consumption. This was not a scandal meant to be exposed. It was a truth meant to be buried. That buried truth became the foundation of her legend. To understand how Claudia Cardinale became both a symbol of cinematic power and a prisoner of her own image, the story must rewind to a world far removed from red carpets and flashbulbs. She was born on April 15, 1938, in Tunis, Tunisia, then under French colonial rule. Her family was Italian, Sicilian by origin, part of a working-class immigrant community trying to carve out stability in a politically fragile land. Her father worked on the railways. Her mother managed the household with discipline and restraint. Claudia grew up speaking Sicilian, Arabic, French, and Italian, belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. From childhood, she was observant, reserved, and guarded. She did not dream of becoming an actress. She dreamed of becoming a teacher. Her beauty, though striking even in adolescence, was never something she sought to use. It was something imposed upon her by others. Noticed, commented on, claimed. Even as a teenager, attention followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. In 1957, during a trip to Italy, she entered a local beauty contest, almost accidentally. She did not win first place, but the industry noticed her immediately. Producers saw a face that felt ancient and modern at once, Mediterranean yet universal. Offers came quickly. Contracts followed faster. Claudia resisted. She was shy. She spoke little Italian. She distrusted the machinery circling around her. But resistance rarely survives contact with power. What no one outside a tight inner circle knew was that she was already pregnant when those contracts were signed. The assault was rewritten publicly as a fictional romance. The child would be presented as her younger brother. The lie was total, enforced, and non-negotiable. For Claudia, fame did not arrive as liberation. It arrived as confinement. Her first screen appearances came in the late 1950s, carefully chosen, tightly controlled. In 1958, she appeared in Goha, introducing her to international audiences. Her presence was magnetic, but restrained, as if she were holding something back. Critics praised her naturalism without understanding its source. What they read as mystery was trauma disciplined into stillness. The breakthrough that changed everything arrived with 1960. Federico Fellini cast her in La Dolce Vita, placing her at the center of a film that would redefine modern cinema. Claudia appeared briefly but indelibly, emerging as an almost mythic vision of unattainable beauty. The world did not just see her, it projected onto her. Desire, fantasy, decadence, all crystallized around her image. Overnight, she became a symbol rather than a person. Fame hit her not as euphoria, but as disorientation. She was watched constantly, controlled relentlessly. Her voice was dubbed in early films because executives felt her accent was not yet acceptable. Even her speech was considered a liability to be managed. Her body, her face, her past, all belonged to the industry now. Behind the scenes, the child she had been forced to deny was growing. Patrick, her son, lived under the fiction of being her brother. Claudia endured interviews where journalists speculated about her personal life, unaware that the truth sat beside her every day. The psychological strain was immense. She later admitted that during this period, she felt like she was living someone else's life while watching her own disappear. Yet the roles kept coming. In 1963, she starred in The Leopard, directed by Luchino Visconti, opposite Burt Lancaster and Alain Delon. The film was a triumph. Her performance carried a quiet melancholy that critics struggled to define. Visconti understood it instinctively. He knew she was not performing sadness. She was containing it. By the mid-1960s, Claudia Cardinale had become one of the most sought-after actresses in Europe and Hollywood. She worked with Sergio Leone, appearing in Once Upon a Time in the West in 1968, a role that placed her at the heart of a violent masculine mythos while allowing her character a rare interior life. She was not merely an object of desire, she was a survivor navigating a brutal world, but survival came at a cost. As her fame peaked, the contradictions of her life deepened. Publicly, she was confident, radiant, untouchable. Privately, she struggled with anxiety, exhaustion, and the long-term psychological effects of trauma never acknowledged. Some believe that her intense work ethic was a form of escape. According to those close to her, she rarely allowed herself to rest, fearing that stillness would force her to confront everything she had been taught to suppress. In 1975, after years of secrecy, the truth about her son finally became public. Patrick was revealed to be her child, not her brother. The revelation reframed her entire story. What could have destroyed her image instead humanized her. For the first time, Claudia spoke openly about control, exploitation, and survival. The confession did not weaken her legacy. It strengthened it. Yet something shifted. The industry that once consumed her beauty began to move on. Youth replaced experience. Silence replaced adoration. Claudia continued working, choosing roles with intention rather than ambition. She became selective, political, outspoken about women's rights and abuse in the film industry long before such conversations were widely accepted. As the years passed, her appearances grew rarer. By the early 2000s, she stepped further away from the spotlight. Interviews became reflections rather than promotions. Fame, she said, was never something she loved. It was something she endured. In later years, reports surfaced of health struggles and legal disputes, including a highly publicized case in 2017 involving allegations of guardianship abuse that she strongly denied, later resolving the matter and reclaiming control over her life. To some, it felt like history repeating itself, another attempt to speak for her, decide for her, manage her existence. Her last public appearances in the late 2010s were quiet, dignified, almost ceremonial. No farewell tour, no final statement, just a gradual withdrawal. Which brings us back to the reports that open this story. Not an ending, but a vanishing. When the camera goes dark on a life like Claudia Cardinale's, what remains is not the image, but the endurance behind it. A woman shaped by violence who refused to be defined by it. A star who carried silence like armor. A survivor who learned that sometimes the most radical act is to step away and reclaim oneself from the gaze of the world. And perhaps that is the real mystery. Not where she went, but how she survived long enough to choose disappearance on her own terms. By the end of the 1960s, Claudia Cardinale was no longer simply an actress. She had become an idea. Her face was printed across magazines. Her name carried weight in both European art cinema and Hollywood spectacle, and her presence seemed to bridge two worlds that rarely spoke to each other. Yet behind the immaculate photographs and carefully rehearsed interviews, the psychological pressure was beginning to show cracks that no camera lens could capture. The late 1960s and early 1970s marked the height of her global power, but also the beginning of an internal fracture. In 1968, Once Upon a Time in the West premiered, and with it came one of the most complex female characters ever written in a genre that rarely allowed women depth. Jill McBain was not a passive ornament. She was a woman navigating grief, violence, and survival in a merciless landscape. Audiences saw strength, critics saw evolution. What they did not see was how closely the role mirrored Claudia's own emotional terrain. Fame at this level did not grant freedom. It tightened the grip. Every movement was monitored. Every decision required approval. Studios expected availability, obedience, and silence. According to those close to her, Claudia began experiencing periods of deep exhaustion, not just physical, but existential. She was working constantly, yet felt increasingly disconnected from the image being sold as her identity. Her relationships during this period reflected that imbalance. She was romantically linked to powerful men, including producers and directors, relationships shaped by unequal power dynamics rather than genuine intimacy. Some believe that these connections offered protection within the industry, while others believe they reinforced the very structures that had stripped her of agency years earlier. Claudia herself would later describe love during this era as something negotiated rather than lived. In 1971, she starred in The Professionals and continued appearing in major international productions. Yet her enthusiasm for Hollywood began to fade. The American system, with its rigid contracts and manufactured personas, felt increasingly suffocating. She gravitated back toward European cinema, where directors allowed ambiguity, silence, and emotional complexity. This was not a retreat, it was a recalibration. The early 1970s also marked a slow psychological reckoning. The secret surrounding her son had grown heavier with time. Patrick was no longer a child. The lie that protected her career now threatened to distort both their lives. According to those close to her, the tension reached a breaking point in the mid-1970s. That breaking point arrived publicly in 1975. In that year, Claudia Cardinale confirmed what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Patrick was her son. The story of a younger brother was a fabrication imposed by fear, control, and an industry unwilling to accommodate reality. The revelation sent shockwaves through European media. Some expected scandal, others anticipated backlash. Instead, something unexpected happened. The public response was largely empathetic. For the first time, Claudia was seen not only as an icon, but as a woman who had endured coercion and survived it. The confession reframed her entire narrative. What had once been interpreted as aloofness now read as self-preservation. What had been labeled mystery was understood as endurance. Yet liberation did not arrive instantly. Admitting the truth did not erase the psychological scars left by years of enforced silence. Claudia later admitted that motherhood, while grounding, also forced her to confront grief she had never been allowed to process. The trauma of the assault, the isolation of fame, and the weight of deception converged into a period of deep introspection. Professionally, her choices shifted. She began selecting roles that explored moral ambiguity, aging, and internal conflict. In 1977, her performance in The Desert of the Tartars reflected a growing preoccupation with time, decay, and the quiet violence of waiting. She was no longer interested in being adored. She was interested in being understood. As the 1980s approached, the industry's obsession with youth intensified. New faces emerged, studios redirected attention. For Claudia, this transition was not abrupt but unmistakable. The invitation slowed. Budgets shrank. Roles grew smaller. Yet, unlike many of her contemporaries, she did not disappear. She adapted. During the 1980s, she remained active in European cinema, television, and theater. She also became increasingly outspoken about women's rights, particularly the exploitation of young actresses. Long before public conversations about abuse became mainstream, Claudia spoke about power imbalance, coercion, and the psychological cost of fame. Some applauded her honesty, others quietly distanced themselves. Rumors persisted that her candor made her difficult in an industry that still preferred compliance. According to some insiders, doors quietly closed. Claudia, however, seemed unconcerned. She had already learned the price of silence. She was no longer willing to pay it. By the 1990s, she had transitioned into a different cultural role. No longer the industry's obsession, she became its memory. Retrospectives celebrated her past work. Festivals honored her legacy. Younger actresses cited her as an influence. Yet Claudia herself resisted nostalgia. She rarely revisited old films, preferring to look forward rather than backward. Privately, she lived with increasing restraint. Fame, she once said, was like living inside a glass house. In her later years, she sought walls. The new century did not bring peace so much as new challenges. In 2017, reports emerged alleging that Claudia was being placed under guardianship against her will. Headlines suggested vulnerability, loss of control, decline. Claudia responded forcefully, denying the claims and asserting her autonomy. The legal dispute was resolved, but the episode unsettled many who saw in it an echo of her early life, yet another attempt by others to define her capacity, her voice, her agency. The incident reignited conversations about how aging women, even legends, are treated once they are no longer profitable. Claudia's name once again became a battleground between image and reality. Her final public appearances in the late 2010s were subdued, dignified, and brief. She attended select festivals, offered measured interviews, and spoke with clarity about survival, memory, and the illusion of glamour. There was no farewell speech, no official goodbye, only a gradual retreat into privacy, which is why the recent reports feel so unsettling, not because they announce an ending, but because they confirm a silence. A woman who once stood at the center of the world has stepped beyond its gaze, and perhaps after everything she endured, that silence is not absence at all. It is control. As the world moved deeper into the 21st century, Claudia Cardinale existed in a strange space between presence and memory. She was no longer chased by cameras, yet she had not vanished. Her name still carried weight, but it was spoken with reverence rather than hunger. She had crossed the invisible line where icons stop being consumed and begin being archived. And yet, even in this quieter phase, the forces that had shaped her life never fully loosened their grip. In her later interviews throughout the 2000s, Claudia spoke with a clarity that felt earned rather than polished. She rejected the myth that fame had saved her. She described it instead as something she survived. She spoke openly about the violence she endured as a teenager, about how the industry responded not with protection but with strategy, turning trauma into a public relations problem. These reflections were not confessions, they were corrections. Some believe that this honesty is why her later years were marked by distance rather than celebration. According to those close to her, Claudia was never interested in being reinvented as a nostalgic figure. She resisted tributes that flattened her into an image. She preferred complexity, even if it made audiences uncomfortable. Her relationship with her son Patrick remained central. The child who had once been erased for the sake of her career became the proof of her survival. Motherhood, long delayed in truth, grounded her in a reality that fame never could. In private, she was not an icon. She was simply a woman who had endured more than most and learned how to live with it. Yet aging brought vulnerability, and vulnerability invited intrusion. The events of 2017 marked one of the most disturbing chapters of her later life. Reports surfaced suggesting that Claudia had been placed under a form of guardianship, implying diminished capacity and loss of autonomy. The narrative spread quickly, echoing a familiar pattern. Once again, her voice was at risk of being overridden by others claiming authority over her life. Claudia responded with resolve. She denied the allegations, challenged the narrative, and reclaimed control. The situation was resolved, but the psychological impact lingered. For many observers, it felt like history repeating itself. A woman who had spent her life fighting to define herself once again, forced to prove she was capable of doing so. After this incident, her withdrawal from public life became more pronounced. Appearances grew rare, statements became brief. The world, accustomed to her image, struggled with her absence, and absence, in the case of legends, often breeds speculation. Some believe she chose silence as a final act of resistance. Others suggest health concerns played a role. What is certain is that she refused to perform decline. There were no staged farewells, no curated final bows. She simply stepped back. Her last widely noted public appearances in the late 2010s were calm, almost ceremonial. She spoke of cinema as something that had passed through her rather than defined her. She rejected the idea of legacy as something one can control. Memory, she implied, belongs to others. Survival belongs to oneself. This perspective reframes her entire life story. Claudia Cardinale was never merely a symbol of beauty. She was a case study in endurance within a system built on extraction. Her career exposed the contradictions of an industry that celebrates women while silencing them, that desires authenticity but punishes truth. She succeeded not because the system protected her, but because she learned how to navigate it without surrendering entirely. Her performances endure because they contain something unresolved, a tension between vulnerability and restraint, a quiet resistance beneath elegance. In films like The Leopard, Once Upon a Time in the West, and La Dolce Vita, her presence carries an emotional weight that cannot be explained by technique alone. It comes from lived experience transmuted into stillness. You can see it in her eyes, not mystery for mystery's sake, but awareness, the look of someone who knows what the world is capable of taking and has decided carefully what she will still give. Today, retrospectives frame her as a bridge between eras, between European art cinema and Hollywood mythology. Feminist critics revisit her story as an early example of how power operates behind glamour. Younger generations encounter her not as gossip, but as history, and yet unresolved questions remain. What might her life have been if the assault had been met with justice instead of silence? What choices would she have made if her early career had not been built on concealment? How many performances were shaped by pain audiences were never meant to see? These questions have no answers, only echoes, which brings us back to the reports that open this story, not declarations of an end, but acknowledgments of distance, a legend no longer visible, a voice no longer offering commentary, a presence receding into privacy. In a culture obsessed with spectacle, disappearance can feel unsettling, but for Claudia Cardinale, disappearance may be the most truthful chapter of all. She spent her life being seen before she was understood, watched before she was heard, claimed before she could claim herself. If silence is where she has chosen to reside now, then perhaps it is not absence, but arrival. The news reports fade, the screens move on, but the shadow she leaves behind remains, not as an image frozen in time, but as a question that lingers long after the camera cuts to black. Some stars burn out, some fall, and some, like Claudia Cardinale, simply step away, leaving behind a trail of light, silence, and a mystery that was never meant to be solved. Because the darkest stories are not always the ones that end, they are the ones that endure.